Hello, hello, and happy Wednesday. This week I've got what I think is a relatively easy and fun little art process that I'm really hoping you'll want to grab your art supplies and join me in creating. We're going to be practicing working with salt and do a tiny amount of color blending, and then we'll do some pen work. But before we get to doing that, I wanted to share with you something I came across that I think is such good advice for getting through challenges. And I think it's applicable not only to other parts of our lives, but it can definitely apply to the creative process. So my friend Janice introduced me to this author from the UK. Her name is Becky Hemsley, and she's written some books of poetry that are really inspirational and that I just love. And I came across a poem in one of her books that I feel could be a very helpful poem for you to hear as well. So I'll put her contact information and all of her social media stuff in my video description below, because her books are really neat and I think it'd be fun for you to discover them too. But for now, I want to read you this one poem from her book, Letters from Life, Words to Feed Your Heart and Soul. The poem is called Just a Phase. Just a phase. When you look up to the moon tonight, you may only see a small crescent of it. The shape a child draws when they add the moon to their pictures and their paintings. You will look up and see only a tiny part of the moon, but you will not think less of it. You won't think that it's not trying hard enough. You won't assume it is being lazy. You won't find it any less beautiful. You will know that it's simply going through a phase and that one day soon it will be full again. Well, sometimes we are like the moon. Sometimes we go through phases where we are full, and sometimes we go through phases where we can only give others a tiny part of us. And if that's you right now, remember, you are not being lazy, you are still beautiful, and you are enough. This is just a phase you're going through. That's all, just a phase. So I bring up this little poem because I have mentioned in a number of my videos that the painting process, though it can be fun, relaxing, and very mindful, there can also be parts of the painting process that can be very challenging. In almost each and every single painting I make, there is a phase of my painting process that I call the ugly phase that is challenging to get through. That's because when I look at what I've created so far in the process, I'm not really loving what I'm seeing. Well, there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, the painting's not finished. And second of all, it's because it's in the process of becoming what it wants to become, but it's not there yet. So, like this poem, Just a Phase, I'm bringing this up because it is also just a phase of your creative process. It's a very normal phase of the creative process. I think most artists that I've ever discussed with will tell you the same thing. They very often will experience this. And so it's not just you. It's not about your lack of skill or your lack of ability or anything. It's a phase. It's a very normal phase of the creative process. And the only way to get out of it is to stick with the process, to keep working through it. And oftentimes when we give ourselves that chance, we make it to the other side and we can actually create something that we're far more satisfied with. But it's a challenge, and it's not an easy challenge to undertake. So I wanted to make sure that I brought this up because if you're a beginner, or if you've been painting for a year, whatever, there's a good chance you're either going to encounter this phase or that you already have encountered this phase. And I want to encourage you to not give up when you get there, because this is the part of the painting process that's almost like the tipping point. It's that part that can go either way. And if you stick through it and keep working on your painting, you're gonna learn a ton. You're gonna learn a ton about your own creative voice and how you love to express your own creative voice. You're gonna learn about your skills, the things that you already have a fair amount of ability to do, and the things that maybe you want to practice some more because you want to improve. You're also gonna learn what you like in terms of color blends, mark making. You're gonna learn a ton, and it often happens near that ugly phase of the process. So it's important to stick it through, and yeah, I felt like it was important for me to bring this up this week. So I'm not going to belabor the issue. I've mentioned it before, but I thought I'd bring it up with this poem because this poem for me was a great reminder that in every challenge we face in life, the challenge itself is only temporary. And if we can just stick with it, we can get through it. Alrighty, it is time to get painting. So grab your watercolors, some paper, brushes, and let's get to it. I'm starting my process this week with some quinacridone magenta, opera pink, and some phthalo turquoise. I want to keep it relatively simple because I want to practice adding salt to my paper and seeing the different effects that I can create. And I also want to do a bit of very simple color blending. So I've initially added this magenta to my paper, and I'm gonna wipe my brush clean, and then I'm coming in with the opera pink, and I'm gonna add the opera pink right next to the magenta. These two colors are very similar, and so they're gonna blend very well together. They're not gonna create any mud, and it's gonna create a little bit of an effect of the color being brighter on the edges, which is what I'm trying to go for. And I want, again, to just practice very simple blending. So I'm adding the color, and once I'm done adding the opera pink, I'm gonna come in and add a little bit of fine grained table salt. You'll notice that on the right-hand side of my paper, the paper is a little bit drier where the paint was applied, and it's a little bit wetter on the left-hand side. So I'm applying the fine-grained table salt on all of that surface, and we'll see when it dries what kind of an effect it creates. My guess is where the paper was wetter, you're probably going to see more of an effect, and when where the paper was a bit drier, you'll see less of an effect, but we'll see. This turquoise color that I'm adding right now is a color that would also probably blend relatively well with the opera pink and the magenta to create a purple, but I've decided that I'm not going to let them touch while they're wet so they won't blend together, because I want to have a space where I can also do some pen work that will be relatively easy and simple to make. So in each and every area of the painting where I'm gonna add paint, I'm gonna add some fine grained salt, and we'll see how when it dries, what kind of effects this is gonna create. I'm coming in with some pretty intense color right from the get-go. Usually, and very often, I like to start my process with a more diluted wash of color to start things off. And I do think that this also has an effect on the salt. Because there's a lot of pigment in the paint right now, I have a feeling that the salt is not going to create the kind of dramatic effects that I sometimes get when I first add that initial color on my paper.
The fine-grained salt added some interesting effects. And now that the paper is completely dry and I removed the salt that was initially there, I want to also try to create some different effects using the coarse grain salt. So I'm adding this purple to the center of my magenta and opera pink. It's a color that goes well with both these colors, and it's a color similar to what could have been created had I mixed the purple with the turquoise, though it might have been a little bit darker. But anyway, I want to add more pigment in this area, and I'll add more water. When you're working with coarse grain salt, it works differently than fine grain salt in the sense of the effects that it'll create on the paper. So for me, what I find works the best is having a lot of paint and pigment on the paper and adding the coarse grain salt. And then once I've added the coarse grain salt, I like to come in and drop even more paint over top the granules of salt, which I'll show you in just a second. Once the paper is dry, I find the easiest way to remove the salt from the paper is to come in with an old plastic card and sort of just like scrape the salt off the painting. And once I move the card, you'll see that the effects left by the coarse grain salt are a lot different than the effects left by the fine grain salt. And I love that you can do, such different effects using basically the same element, but in a different format. When it comes to working with salt and with watercolors in general, I find that experimentation is key, that it's good to be willing to try different things, to try adding salt at different times of the drying process, to try adding it when there's more pigment, when there's less pigment, etc., etc. Watercolors in general have sort of a mind of their own, and the salt, when it interacts with the water and the watercolors, will also have its own thing it wants to do. So as much as possible, I try to embrace that, and I would like to encourage you to do the same. There is no absolute way a painting has to be. This area of the painting is already quite dark because of the addition of the purple. And yet I have all of these interesting textures that were left by the salt, and I want to draw attention to them. So I need to find a way to make the colors and the marks stand out from the rest. And that's why I am working with black right now. The black ink will be the darkest value in this area, and that will help make everything else stand out. So I'm adding some black ink using my brush pen and my fountain pen, and that's helping to delineate the shapes that are in this area. And it's also helping to make the colors that are in this area pop more. When it comes to deciding on areas where I will create some marks with my pens and my markers, I like to either give myself an area to do that. So by leaving those white spaces, I've given myself an area where I can add some vertical lines. And I also like to look in the paint itself to see what kind of marks have been left. And sometimes the marks will delineate a certain area and help me figure out where I can add my pen marks. So for me, it's an intuitive process. In this case, it was a little bit planned to be that way because I wanted to show you that you can actually create this for yourself, or it can just happen naturally when you're working with your salt and your paint, and different areas will get delineated by the paint and the salt all on their own. So it's all about bringing yourself into the moment and looking at what's going on your paint, on your surface, and seeing what nudges, what intuitive nudges you're getting. So for me, leaving those blank white marks, shapes in the paper, I knew I didn't want to leave them white because they were not going to be very interesting that way. So that was a very natural and easy area for me to come in and add some vertical lines. And then other times I just pick what's in already in the paint. And just looking at this area in the middle of the painting where the pink and the purple meet, you can see that there are lines there as well that were left by the purple on top of the magenta and the opera pink. And I could have easily gone in there and also delineated that area. So there's a ton of stuff happening, and there's all kinds of different directions that the painting can guide you to go. It's all about following your intuition and picking the path that seems to be the most interesting to you. After I read you the poem, It's Just a Phase, I talked a bit about the quote unquote ugly phase of the painting process where, sometimes things happening on our paper or on our canvas or on whatever substrate it is we're using, the things that are showing up for us aren't really speaking to us for whatever reason. I think it's important to work through that. And I think one of the easiest way to work through that is to let go of the expectation or the pressure of having to create something exact or something a certain way. Because the more fun we can approach the whole process, and when we approach the tackling the challenge of the ugly phase of the painting process with a curious mind and almost with a childlike mind, like children when they're painting, I don't even know that they actually stop to think about, what parts of the painting speak to them the most. They just do it. They do it. And they do it with such abandon and joy. And when they're finished, they love whatever it is that shows up because they created it and they're so proud of themselves. And I'd like for us to be able to do something similar, to approach our creative process with abandon, with curiosity, and a desire to learn, because ultimately that's what will help us grow and develop as better artists. I sincerely believe that. This area right here is a perfect example of me having done something and not really like what I've done. Like I created those vertical lines with my fountain pen that were a little bit thicker than the other lines I had created above. And I liked the finer lines, but I wasn't really crazy about the thicker lines, especially the fact that they were just floating. And I thought initially that I would like it, but it turns out that it wasn't really my favorite thing. So I look for a way that I can quote unquote correct that as easily as possible. And for me, that was just taking my pen and actually connecting all the lines. And now I'm coming in with my dotting pen and I'm adding some stippling to sort of delineate those areas. And it's a way, like I'm always looking for the simplest way to work around to work a solution, to find a solution to what challenge I'm facing. It wasn't my biggest challenge. I've had way bigger challenges on other paintings in the past, but it was an example of something I did in a painting that, I'm not sure I like that. So I can't delete or erase the black ink, but I can come in with something else and find a way to make it work. And that's what I did. And after adding that black line and now adding the stippling, I'm liking it way better already. Earlier, I added some black to the center of my painting, what I'm considering my focal point. And this was to sort of help create more contrast in this area because this area was a lot darker and I wanted to make the marks and the shapes stand out. So now I'm coming in and I'm adding more contrast, this time in terms of lighter value contrast using my rutile blue pearl. And that's going to help to make the shapes and the colors again in this area stand out more. So never underestimate the power of contrast. It can do wonders for a painting. And you'll see as I continue to work this blue pearl into this area, how much brighter this area is going to start to look. And it only took a tiny amount of paint. Now, if you weren't able to get this color where you live, you could achieve a somewhat similar effect by using even a paint that isn't iridescent. Like if you went in with a little bit of a light wash of gesso, like white gesso or white gouache, you could create a similar effect to what I'm creating right now, and it would also be very effective. But I love working with iridescence, so I had to try it in this area, and I thought the rutile blue pearl would work really well with the magenta and the purple and everything that's going on underneath. And I'm really liking it. It really does look pretty spectacular. So I'm going to add a little bit more of it. Um, Once I add an element in an area of the painting, I like to also add it elsewhere. Otherwise, the painting doesn't look quite as cohesive as it could. And so by adding a little bit more of this rutile blue pearl in other areas, it's going to help bring everything together. thought it would be nice to add some of this blue pearl in the turquoise sections of the painting, but as I'm adding it, I'm noticing that it's not really very visible, and that's probably because it's a blue on top of a blue, and it's an iridescent translucent paint on top of that. So it will probably reflect the light and still be somewhat visible, but I want it to have something a little bit stronger in this area. And so I'm adding it, but I think I'm just gonna brush it off as soon as I'm done adding it. And I'll do it with a damp brush, and that'll keep some of it on the paper, but then I'll go over it with my magic green, because magic green will stand out more in this area than this color is right now. And yeah, it's an interesting thing because you can still see a little glimmer of that color in the back. And even though I'm adding the magic green on top, I like the fact that this is sort of just gonna like be peeking through. And I sort of wish I had done it elsewhere in the painting also, but that's okay. That's something I learned in this process that I can now do in a different process later on in the future. So it's all about learning. It's all about getting through, working through some challenges, figuring out what it is I like and what I don't like, and then taking that with me for my next project. It was a very quick little process, but lots of fun nonetheless. And with these last few little dots of magic green, I'm ready to say my painting is finished, and I will soon be removing the tape so we can have a closer look. Because I kept the layers of paint very simple, in fact, I only had a second layer of paint on the center portion of the painting. You can still see a lot of the marks that were left by the salt. And the painting itself is very simple and fun. It doesn't need to be complicated to be something worth creating. And for me, this is actually really beautiful. I love the way the colors play with each other. I love how the iridescent paints dance on top of everything. And I feel like the elements just really work well together. And I'm happy I tried to keep it simple. I'm happy I did keep it simple. Because really, there was nothing complicated about this, but it was just a joy to create. And I think it was all the more fun to create because it was so simple. I want to thank you once again for making the time to join me on my creative journey. I hope you're feeling inspired and ready to tackle your next creative project. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!